December 1st, 1959. Hold that date. The United States and the Soviet Union, nations that had spent the previous decade rehearsing each other's annihilation, sign a single document agreeing to freeze all territorial claims to Antarctica, ban military activity, and restrict independent access to the continent indefinitely. No other agreement like it exists in the Cold War record. No other subject produced this convergence. And I have spent a long time asking one question that the history books never quite answer. What discovery, what sight, what thing found beneath the ice could have made bitter enemies decide together that no one else should go there unsupervised? Because here is the thing about that treaty. It did not happen slowly. It did not emerge from years of quiet back-channel negotiation the way arms agreements did. It did not require a decade of careful diplomacy. It arrived in 11 months. 11 months from the end of a field season, to a signed document that both superpowers ratified before the decade closed. And when you understand what was happening in those 11 months, when you understand what had just been found in the Antarctic interior, that timeline stops feeling like a coincidence and starts feeling like a reaction. The story the textbooks tell begins with cooperation. It is 1957, the height of the Cold War, and 67 nations have agreed to set aside their rivalries for 18 months in the name of science. They called it the International Geophysical Year. The stated goals were modest and sensible. Coordinate research, share data, advance the collective understanding of the planet's physical systems. Antarctica was designated a focal point, neutral ground, a continent with no indigenous population, no prior colonial claim that had stuck, no strategic value that anyone was prepared to say out loud. Hold that framing, because what was actually deployed to Antarctica during the International Geophysical Year was not a research team. It was a military operation wearing a research team's clothes. The United States Navy expanded Operation Deep Freeze into the largest American logistical presence the continent had ever seen. Ships, aircraft, construction equipment, personnel counts that no meteorological survey has ever required. Icebreakers, transport vessels, aerial reconnaissance assets. The official mission description covered supply and infrastructure support for scientific stations. The operational footprint suggested something considerably more than that. And the language in Navy planning documents from this period is careful in the specific way that language becomes careful when it is trying to account for something without naming it. Every word chosen, every ambiguity deliberate. The Soviet contribution was, if anything, more striking. Rather than establishing stations at the accessible coastal margins where supply lines would be manageable, Soviet planners pushed directly into the most hostile interior on Earth. Vostok Station was built at the pole of inaccessibility, not the geographic South Pole, not a coastal position with reasonable supply access. The single point on the Antarctic continent furthest from any ocean in every direction. The coldest reliably recorded temperature on Earth would later be measured there. -89.2 degrees Celsius. The logistical cost of sustaining a permanent station at that location in 1957, with the technology available, was not a minor inconvenience. It was an enormous and continuous drain of resources that the Soviet government absorbed without public explanation of why that specific location was worth it. You do not build a permanent station at the most inaccessible, most lethal point on a continent because the meteorological data is slightly better there. You build it because something at that location is worth the cost. Two superpowers, one deploying naval assets at military scale, the other pushing to the most inaccessible interior position available, both officially in the name of science, both officially cooperating. And both, as the field season progressed, becoming very quiet about what their interior survey teams were actually finding. The orthodox explanation for the military-scale deployment is straightforward, and I want to be fair to it. Antarctica is genuinely dangerous. Logistics there genuinely require heavy infrastructure. The Cold War meant both nations were going to project capability even in scientific contexts. Competition drove investment. Prestige drove ambition. I have read that explanation carefully, and I accept that it accounts for a portion of what was deployed. It does not account for the specific choices. It does not explain why Vostok was positioned where it was. It does not explain why aerial reconnaissance assets appeared in what was supposed to be a meteorological program. It does not explain the particular and persistent intensity of interest in interior geology that appears quietly in expedition planning documents from both programs. And it does not explain what Soviet scientists found in 1958 in the deep interior of the continent, beneath miles of accumulated ice. A mountain range, not a modest subglacial feature, not an elevated plateau or a gradual rise in the bedrock. A massive, jagged mountain range with peaks comparable in scale to the Alps, buried under ice that had been accumulating for millions of years. They named it the Gamburtsev Subglacial Mountains. The discovery was reported. It was noted in scientific literature. And then, in the way that certain findings get noted and filed, and not prominently discussed, it became part of the background record rather than the foreground conversation. A remarkable geological discovery assigned to footnotes. A mountain range the size of the Alps mentioned in appendices. If you read those appendices carefully, what you find is not simple. Standard glaciological models have a well-established account of what happens to mountain ranges under long-term ice sheets. Erosion. The weight and movement of glacial ice grinds down exposed rock over geological timescales. Jagged peaks become rounded forms, sharp ridges smooth. The process is slow but consistent, and over the millions of years that ice has covered Antarctica, it should have left its unmistakable mark on anything beneath it. The Gamburtsev Mountains have been under ice for an estimated 14 to 30 million years. That is not a short duration. That is geological time. That is enough time for erosion to do its work thoroughly. The Gamburtsev Mountains are jagged. Sharply, anomalously jagged, in a way that the accumulated weight of 30 million years has not softened the way it should have. The peaks that Soviet instrumentation mapped in 1958 are sharp. The ridgelines are defined. The relief is dramatic in a way that looks geologically young in a place that is geologically ancient. And the scientific community has been sitting with that discrepancy for more than 60 years now. The explanations exist, and I want to be precise about them because they are genuine attempts to resolve a genuine anomaly. Subglacial meltwater dynamics. Localized thermal anomalies at the ice-bed interface. The possibility that certain glacial flow patterns protected the peaks from the full erosive force of the overlying sheet. Researchers have worked seriously on these mechanisms. Papers have been written. Models have been proposed. What those papers and models have not produced is a settled consensus that resolves the discrepancy cleanly. The anomaly remains open. One glaciologist, writing about the Gamburtsev Range, used a phrase I find difficult to improve upon. He called it among the least understood major topographic features on Earth. Least understood. For a feature discovered in 1958. Hold that. Now add the magnetic data, because the mountains are not the only thing in the Gamburtsev field records that went quiet. Magnetic surveying was standard procedure during the International Geophysical Year. Both superpowers conducted aeromagnetic surveys, mapping the continent's subsurface signature from aircraft. The resulting data was, in its broad outlines, shared and published. In its specific details, particularly regarding anomalous interior readings. The published summaries and the raw field records do not always tell precisely the same story, not a dramatic divergence. The quieter kind, where certain readings appear in technical appendices filed with institutional sponsors and receive less elaboration in versions prepared for general scientific circulation. The magnetic anomalies in the Gamburtsev region are localized in a way that does not map cleanly onto the surrounding bedrock geology. Soviet geophysicists noted this as requiring further investigation. That further investigation in the published record is not prominently visible. The notation exists. The follow-up does not match the level of attention the original notation suggested was warranted. I know what the rational response to that is: institutional inertia, resource constraints. The International Geophysical Year produced an enormous volume of data, and not every flagged anomaly received the follow-up it deserved. All of that is true. All of that accounts for some of what I am describing, and yet the pattern holds across both programs, not just the Soviet one. The American aerial survey data from the same period shows the same distribution. Routine findings discussed openly. Anomalous interior readings handled with a precision of language that is more careful than it is communicative. Both programs operating in active competition, arriving independently at the same category of quiet around the same category of finding. Not the weather data, not the biological specimens. The interior geology, the deep formations, the features beneath the ice. That convergence is the point where the orthodox explanation does not merely strain, it collapses. Because for institutional inertia to account for what the record shows, you need to believe that two programs with every incentive to outcompete each other. Programs whose governments were pointing nuclear weapons at each other in the same calendar year. Independently developed the same instinct toward caution around the same specific type of Antarctic interior data. Two enemies, same silence, same category of finding, same speed of suppression. The probability of that being coincidence shrinks the more carefully you look at it. The human record around the interior geophysical work of 1958 is thin in ways that are difficult to explain by chance. The scientists whose names appear in published findings, the meteorologists, the biologists, the glaciologists whose routine work produced publishable results, are documented, careers traceable, papers cited, biographies available. The personnel attached to interior survey operations in the Gamburtsev region appear in institutional rosters and largely not elsewhere. A Soviet geophysicist whose name is present in the Vostok Station records from 1958 published one paper directly addressing the mountain findings. One paper. Then in the available literature, he did not return to the subject. That paper ends without a conclusion, not inconclusively, without one. In the way that papers end without conclusions when the author is not prepared to state what the data suggests. When the data points somewhere the author cannot follow in print. I want to be precise about what I am, and am not saying here because the distinction matters. I am not saying these men were silenced in any dramatic or coercive sense. I am saying the human record around the interior geophysical work of 1958 is thin in the specific way that records become thin when the people who could fill them chose not to. Individual decisions, made independently, by people on opposite sides of the most significant geopolitical divide in modern history, arriving at the same silence. That pattern of individual choice converging on collective quiet is itself data. And then, 11 months after the 1958 field season ended, the treaty arrived. Consider what it took to produce that document. The United States and the Soviet Union in 1959 were not in a period of diplomatic warmth. This was not a moment of thaw. The Berlin crisis had occurred the previous year. The U-2 incident, an American spy plane shot down over Soviet territory, was 4 months from the treaty signing date. Both nations were engaged in active proxy conflicts, competing space programs, and a nuclear arms race that both governments publicly described in existential terms. They agreed on almost nothing. Arms control negotiations between the same parties would take until 1972. To produce SALT-I nuclear testing agreements required years of difficult negotiation. Agreements on Berlin, on Germany, on spheres of influence in Europe and Asia, on the terms of competition in the developing world, all of them protracted, all of them contested, all of them slow. The specific list of subjects on which American and Soviet negotiators found common ground in the late 1950s is short. Antarctica is on it. Antarctica uniquely produced not just agreement but speed. 12 nations signed the original treaty. The negotiation, acceptable to all 12 including the two superpowers, concluded within 11 months of the IGY field season ending. 11 months. In a diplomatic environment where everything else took years or decades, that speed is not a detail. That speed is a signal. The treaty is 12 articles long. Read it as a legal document rather than a diplomatic symbol, and it does something specific. Article 1 prohibits military activity, weapons testing, and the establishment of military bases. Article 7 grants signatory nations the right to inspect each other's stations. Article 9 establishes a consultation framework among original signatories. These provisions present themselves as openings, as frameworks for cooperative access and mutual transparency. What the treaty does not do, and what receives less attention than it should, is grant open access. Non-signatories have no inspection rights. Independent researchers and private expeditions operate at the discretion of signatory nations. The treaty presents itself as an opening. What it constructed in operational terms is a perimeter, a managed boundary, around a place that two of the most powerful governments in human history decided, in 11 months, required managing. The silence the treaty formalized did not begin in 1959. That is what the record shows if you follow it back. And once you start following it, it becomes genuinely difficult to stop. The expeditions of the 1840s, Wilkes, Ross, Dumont d'Urville, produced official records that diverge from private accounts in consistent ways. The divergences are not random. They follow the same pattern. The routine data, the temperatures, the biological specimens, the navigational measurements, appears in the official record with full detail. The specific interior observations, the accounts of anomalous features, the records of what was seen from the air or the ice surface in the deep interior, appear in private journals and personal correspondence, and then not in the official reports. 100 years before the International Geophysical Year, the pattern was already established. Something about what lies in the Antarctic interior has been producing the same archival instinct, the same movement from foreground to background, for as long as humans have been systematically exploring it. What does that mean? I want to be honest about the limits of what I can tell you. The evidence I have described is real. The Gamburtsev Mountains are real. The glaciological anomaly is documented and unresolved. The magnetic data is in the field records. The treaty timeline is a matter of historical fact. The pattern of selective publication across competing programs is visible in the archival record to anyone who looks at it carefully. What I cannot tell you with certainty is what caused that pattern. What I can tell you is that the explanations that have been offered do not fully account for it. The mountains beneath the ice are still there. The magnetic anomalies have not been resolved. The treaty is still in force, extended indefinitely by the Protocol on Environmental Protection signed in 1991. which added further layers of restricted access under the framework of environmental preservation. Every decade, the perimeter is renewed. Every decade, the managed boundary around whatever was found in 1958 is maintained by the same coalition of governments, now expanded. That established it in 11 months at the end of one of the most hostile decades in diplomatic history. I am not asking you to believe something specific about what is under the ice. I am asking you to look at the shape of the response and ask yourself what kind of discovery produces that shape. What kind of finding makes enemies cooperate faster than any other subject in their shared history? What kind of geological anomaly, in a continent that two superpowers were racing to survey, gets assigned to appendices by both programs simultaneously? What kind of feature, discovered in 1958, is still described by working scientists as among the least understood major topographic features on Earth, not because no one has tried to understand it, but because the understanding keeps running into something that the available frameworks do not comfortably accommodate. The ice is still there, the mountains are still beneath it. Whatever was found in the field season of 1958 is still in the location where Soviet instrumentation first mapped it, at the pole of inaccessibility, in the most remote interior of the most restricted continent on Earth. And the treaty that sealed it is still in force, signed by nations that could agree on almost nothing else, in 11 months before the decade that produced the discovery had even closed. Hold that date, December 1st, 1959, and ask yourself what it took to get there.